Good afternoon and welcome to the annual Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture brought to you by the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies and co-sponsored by the Department of Anthropology and our very own South Asia group. My name is Michel Hockx. I'm the director of the Liu Institute. And the Institute's Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture invites top scholars who examine the theme of justice in relation to Asia and with awareness of Asian cultures and traditions. It is a flagship event of our Justice in Asia Research Cluster, which features an ever-increasing number of projects across a range of disciplines and engaging with numerous Asian countries and cultures. After today's lecture, when we retreat to the forum outside for our reception, you can admire posters presenting some of our projects and interact with the relevant researchers. I now have the pleasure of introducing one of our Liu Institute faculty fellows, anthropology Professor Aidan Seale-Feldman, who will moderate tonight's event. Professor Seale-Feldman is a psychological and medical anthropologist specializing in the study of mental health and psychic life. Her research is based in the Nepal Himalayas and also in the United States, where she explores the ethics and politics of psychic life in terms of disaster. In addition to teaching courses on biopolitics, medical and psychological anthropology, the anthropology of ethics and morality, and public-facing anthropology, she also writes on and experiments with ethnographic cinema. It was Professor Seale-Feldman who first suggested to us that we invite today's keynote speaker, and I'm delighted to now hand over to her for a more detailed introduction and to start the event. Please welcome Aidan Seale-Feldman.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Many thanks to Michel Hockx, to Chris Cox, and the Liu Institute for their generous support and for making this event possible. As you just heard, my name is Aidan Seale-Feldman, and I'm very pleased to moderate this year's Justice in Asia Distinguished Lecture and to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alpa Shah. Dr. Shah is currently Professor of Social Anthropology at the London School of Economics. However, this coming fall, she'll be joining the faculty of the University of Oxford as Statutory Professor of Social Anthropology and Fellow of All Souls College. And I read online that she'll be the first woman ever to hold that position in the Department of Anthropology. Forged at the nexus of anthropology and political economy, Dr. Shah's research encompasses a range of interconnected themes, including democracy and human rights, revolutionary insurgency, state and citizenship, global capitalism, inequality and poverty, indigenous politics, and race, caste, class, and gender relations. Much of her writing is based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork among the indigenous people of eastern India, Adivasis. However, she's also conducted research in Nepal and among Dalit communities as well. Dr. Shah's work has been supported by a number of prestigious grants and fellowships, including the European Research Council, the UK Economic and Social Research Council, and the British Academy, as well as the Wenner-Gren Foundation. And in addition to numerous academic articles and edited volumes, she's the author of 4 books, including In the Shadows of the State, Indigenous Politics, Environmentalism, and Insurgency in Jharkhand, India, published by Duke in 2010. As well as Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class, and Inequality in the 21st Century India, published by Pluto Press in 2017. I first discovered Dr. Shah's work when I read her luminous ethnography, Nightmarch, Among India's Revolutionary Guerrillas, published by University of Chicago Press in 2018. This book tells the story of a 7-night, 250-kilometer trek through the forests of eastern India alongside members of India's Naxalite movement at the peak of counterinsurgency operations. Spliced within a riveting ethnographic narrative, Nightmarch develops a nuanced exploration of this long-standing communist rebellion to take up arms against the Indian state. In it, she develops a really careful analysis of the personal and political motivations that have led the heterogeneous members of this long-standing rebellion to take up arms and to join this movement. Nightmarch won the 2020 Association for Political and Legal Anthropology Book Prize and was a finalist for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the New India Foundation Book Prize. To date, it has been translated into 4 languages and received international recognition in The Guardian, The Hindu, Sunday Times, and The New Statesman, which named it as one of the best books of 2018, and I can't recommend this book enough. It's been very inspirational to me. Dr. Shah is one of those rare anthropologists whose brave, powerful, and crystalline writing is able to reach a broad public audience far beyond the limits of the university. I'm certain that this will be the case for her most recent book, The Incarcerations, BK16 and the Search for Democracy in India, which has been published by HarperCollins in the UK and in India and will be released in the US, I believe in July 2024. And there's a flyer outside which you can grab if you'd like to pre-order it and get 15% off using this QR code, so please pick it up if you're interested. Described by Naomi Klein as, quote, a gripping and rigorous crime story, a gripping and rigorous crime story about the murder of a once thriving democracy. The Incarcerations has already been listed as a Financial Times What to Read in 2024 book and has received glowing endorsements in the Times and Nature, among others. As we live through an era defined by an increasing assault on democracy around the world, Dr. Shah's detailed analysis of the criminalization of dissent and systematic silencing of human rights activists will hold lessons of wide relevance far beyond India. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alpa Shah to the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you so much for this extremely generous introduction. It's really a great honor to be here with you today to deliver this lecture. I'm really grateful to Michel Hockx, to Aidan Seale-Feldman, the Liu Institute, the Department for Anthropology for this invitation. I note with great pleasure that the 2022 lecturer was the Indian historian Professor Romila Thapar, who in 2018 filed a petition in a Delhi court against the arrest of the BK16 intellectuals, activists, human rights defenders, who I'm going to talk about today. The petition was unsuccessful, but the one dissenting judge at the time took note that dissent is a safety valve of democracy. If dissent is not allowed, then the pressure cooker may burst, he said. That judge is now the Chief Justice of India, Justice Chandrachud. Sadly, most of the BK16 are still in custody. True to my vocation as an anthropologist, I will not begin with the abstract philosophy or theories of justice, but with real-life stories of injustice and the fight for democracy and justice that is ongoing. I will share with you the story of a remarkable and chilling case at the center of my new book, The Incarcerations, BK16 and the Search for Democracy in India. It's just been released in the UK and India, and it's about to be released here in the US next month. And the publishers or books have kindly given a QR code for anyone who wants to pre-order with a discount. This is a case in which 16 people, human rights lawyers, professors, poets, journalists, artists, trade unionists, found themselves framed as terrorists and incarcerated since 2018 without trial and without bail in the world's largest electoral democracy. I dive into this story today to analyze the question of why they were considered so dangerous as to be silenced behind bars. I believe this question tells us something about some of the most significant contemporary battles for justice and deepening democracy. This is an Indian story, but I believe has much wider resonance. Let me first give you a wider context to The Incarcerations. It was published just before the world's largest election began 2 weeks ago. This is an election in which Prime Minister Narendra Modi is slated to win a third term in power and consolidate the long-term vision of his Bharatiya Janata Party and a wider family of organizations called the Sangh Parivar to make India into a Hindu state to achieve their project of Hindutva, Hindu supremacism in the country, thus subverting the secular vision of its founders of the independent Indian nation state, and explicitly ostracizing a significant Muslim minority of 200 million. Modi himself now presents India not only as the world's largest democracy, but also the oldest democracy, the mother of democracy, in his words, seeking to displace Greece as the birthplace of democracy in the public imagination. At the time of independence from colonial rule, India was conceived as a democratic, even socialist country. This was an idea that was fought for and defended over many years across institutions and through social movements on the ground, extending into the far corners of the country. But today, many critics have pointed out how India is one of the worst autocracies, is authoritarian, and some have called it a fascist state. The Incarcerations joins these critiques to pull back the curtain on democracy, and it does so by telling the thrilling, chilling, and shocking story of this one notorious case, the Bhima Koregaon case, or the BK case. So 16 intellectuals, activists, who were living in different parts of the country, many of them who did not know each other, was simultaneously raided in 2018 by the police of one single city, Pune, in the western Indian state of Maharashtra. So this is just a map to show you, where all the different people who were raided lived all over the place. The Pune police took the computers and other electronic devices of the BK-16. In the initial press conference on the case, so after taking these devices and arresting some of the BK-16, the police had held a press conference in which they showed, they waved these incriminating letters that they had allegedly found on some of these devices. They claimed there was evidence to prove that the BK-16 were Maoist or Naxalite terrorists, referring to this banned Marx, Lenin, and Mao-inspired revolutionary movement that has been simmering in India for the last half century, on which I wrote my last book, as Professor Seale-Feldman kindly highlighted, Nightmarch. And they said that one of these letters, the police said, showed that a number of the BK-16 were plotting to assassinate Prime Minister Modi. There's the letter. This letter was spread to the press. They said, too, that the BK-16 had incited mob violence earlier that year on the 1st of January at a place called Bhima Koregaon. So this is this place, from where this BK acronym emerges. Many of those incarcerated in the place had not even heard of this place. But there, on the 1st of January 2018, hundreds of thousands of Dalits, which are India's formerly untouchable communities, were to gather, as they did every 1st of January, for a Dalit pride celebration around this obelisk, which is actually a British war memorial, which the Dalits had claimed as their own victory pillar, a story I can't go into now, but I can explain to you later. Very interesting for decolonization debates in the university. Those that arrived here on the 1st of January 2018 found themselves under attack. Molotov cocktails, rocks were thrown at them, shops, restaurants, and houses were vandalized and burned. One person died. So in a series of further countrywide raids over the next 2 years, the police force incarcerated the BK-16 using these anti-terror laws which exist in India, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under which bail is impossible, almost impossible. Now, like all good anthropological projects, researching and writing this book took me into directions which I could never have envisaged. For instance, in several sections of the book, I used my anthropological skills to turn into an investigative journalist to unveil some of the fundamental basis of these incarcerations. They include how the violence on the 1st of January 2018 was in fact pre-planned, and it was instigated by the Hindutva supporters, these are Modi supporters, I'm doing it again. Hindutva supporters who were waving saffron flags, the colors of the ruling party, and supported its ideology of Hindutva or Hindu supremacism. The Dalit activist Anita Savale, who was harrowingly caught in the middle of these riots with her children and narrowly escaped, told me how she filed a first information report with the police against the two people whose name the mobs had been chanting. So Milan Ekbore, the guy with the turban there, and Sambaji Bire in the middle over there. However, so the police initially actually imprisoned Milan Ekbore. They arrested him and imprisoned him. But a month later, Ekbore was released from prison, and instead the police force now started new investigations and raids, which led to the incarceration of completely other people, these BK16. So another kind of trajectory that the book took me on was to investigate some of the electronic evidence that was used to incarcerate the BK16. So clone copies of the computers that the police had seized from the BK16 were in fact sent to some of the top US cyber forensic companies, one in Massachusetts here, which is called Arsenal Consulting, who, to their surprise, found one of the most shocking cases of tampering of evidence they had ever seen. Not only had members of the BK16 been snooped on, including using Pegasus spyware, and their emails and computers had been hacked, but also the crucial evidence used by the police to incriminate and incarcerate the BK16, including that assassination plot letter, had been implanted on their computers. I'm not going to give away any spoilers today of how all this happened, the riots or the cyber warfare. I bring them up to show that the evidence used to incarcerate the BK16 is under serious question. Yet almost 6 years since the first arrests, most of them remain in custody, and there is no sign of a trial. As human rights lawyers in India say, with incarceration under these anti-terror laws, conviction rates are lower than 3%, but it is the process which is the punishment. Okay, so the book itself has like 3 enormous chapters on hacking and implantation of evidence and on the riots and how they were instigated. But what I'm going to read to you, I want to read a small section to highlight the point that the process is the punishment. The brutality with which the BK16 were incarcerated and have been treated is perhaps best exemplified by the life of Stan Swami, who was this man here, an 83-year-old Jesuit priest who found himself incarcerated in this case. So, Arun Ferreira, who is a co-accused and an inmate, said about Stan, his inclusion in the case itself was something he could never understand. The nature of the electronic files found in his computer was an impossibility. In the wildest stretch of his imagination, Stan would repeatedly say. For the first few months after his arrest, he failed to understand why the NIA is the Central Anti-Terror Task Force, why the NIA officials repeatedly lied to him in custody. He was increasingly hurt by the system's routine insensitivity and injustice. However, he still nurtured the belief that the special NIA court would see through all this and grant him bail. Then the bail hearing started getting exhaustingly prolonged. The NIA resorted to digging into the accounts of his Ranchi residence, Bagacha. So this is where he lived. He had created this whole indigenous rights center in Ranchi. You can see it in the picture there, called Bagacha means garden. And they started harassing his Jesuit colleagues. This further hurt Stan. And finally, when the NIA judge delivered his order rejecting bail, Stan just could not believe its conclusions, Arun said. Evenings were spent in silence, reading the order over again and again, Arun said. The change in Stan's mood was becoming ever more apparent. His humor, too, gradually disappeared. Even the birthday wishes he received from numerous well-wishers across the globe on April the 26th did not improve things. His increasing weakness amplified his neurological ailments. His hearing deteriorated further. His Parkinson's tremors became increasingly more violent. His eyesight, too, made newspaper reading difficult. He had such severe Parkinson's disease that when I met him last, he couldn't even lift a cup to his mouth because of the shaking of his hands. Mihir Desai, his lawyer, sought medical attention for Stan from the court. Stan appeared through a video conference facility in May and told the court, 8 months ago, I would eat by myself, do some writing, walk. I could take a bath by myself. But all these are disappearing one after another. So Taloja jail has brought me to a situation where I can neither write nor go for a walk by myself. Someone has to feed me. Stan was clear he didn't want to go to the hospital, JJ Hospital, where Varvara Rao, another 80-year-old co-accused, had been left in his own urine for weeks. He said, only one thing that I would request the judiciary is to consider for interim bail. That is the only request. Whatever happens to me, I would like to be with my own. In his last days, Stan wanted to return to the indigenous people of Jharkhand. That wasn't to happen. The NIA courts rejected his pleas and were even against him moving to a private hospital. As his health further deteriorated, Mihir Desai finally managed to get him moved on 28th May into the Jesuit-run Holy Family Hospital in Mumbai. But it was too late. Stan was admitted into the intensive care unit and given oxygen support. 2 days later, he tested positive for COVID-19. Meanwhile, the High Court, which was supposed to hear his bail plea on 3rd July 2021, adjourned the hearing to 3 days later. Stan had a cardiac arrest early the next morning on 4th July 2021, was put on ventilator support, and died the next day. So I knew Stan from my days living as an anthropologist amongst the Adivasis, the indigenous forest dwellers in the eastern Indian state of Jharkhand, where he had for 3 decades fought against the brutality of mining operations and state atrocities targeted at Adivasis and for the protection of their land and forests and their way of life. Given that I had also worked with armed Naxalite guerrillas on whose spread I had written my last book, Nightmarch, I was shocked to hear that Stan was imprisoned as a Naxalite. I said to you, he could hardly even lift a cup to his lips. A few months before Stan Swami was incarcerated, one of the editors of Nightmarch reached out to me and said, Alpa, we really need a book on the BK case, and you are the person to write it. And he laid out many reasons why I should do that, which included the success of Nightmarch as being seen as a balanced, nuanced account of the Naxalite guerrillas and their spread among the Adivasis. And the fact that he felt that no one in India was in a position to write such a book, as everyone who tried to touch this case was themselves being persecuted. Like many other publishers, journalists, intellectuals in India, he was shocked by these incarcerations. At the time, I felt I could not say yes. We were in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. University workloads had tripled overnight. Those of us who had serious caring responsibilities could barely breathe. Yet I knew I couldn't say no. I knew the writings and work of most of the BK16. Many had been important to the development of my own scholarship. Several had been invited guests at the LSE. One had even been on the advisory board of a major research project I had run over 5 years on the underbelly of the Indian economic growth. What did decolonial scholarship mean if we couldn't write in solidarity and stand by our colleagues in the global south when they were incarcerated? When Stan died, it propelled me to work every night and weekend for the next 4 years so that the book could be published just ahead of these general elections. So my wider anatomy of the Bhima Koregaon case shows how it is a bellwether for the collapse of democracy in India and reveals the weapons being used for the rise of authoritarianism, what some have termed an Indian form of fascism. Let me briefly share with you some of the highlights. First, It shows the growth and use of whole sections of the masses who are ready to take on a moral policing of society as vigilantes without leaders even giving out orders. And this is what happened in the riots at Bhima Koregaon, which I don't have time to go into here, but it's more generally being, happening all over India with public lynchings against Dalits, Muslims and Adivasis, which has become very common, undertaken usually by men who take it into their own hands to police these minorities for alleged acts of desecration of the cow, or eating beef, or stealing of Hindu women by having any relationship with them. Second, it shows how the regime in power is creating a mythic past and the notion of a superhuman race. I don't have time to go into this here either, but the objection of the rioting mobs was that Bhima Koregaon celebrations divided Indians and that we needed to create a new unity for a Hindu race that was going to lead not only India but the world. Third, the active protection of such regime supporters who are conducting the atrocities, which are backed by a very partial police force. So in this case, we see the Pune police being used to divert attention from the Hindutva instigators of the riots at Bhima Koregaon, who were let off the hook, marking a more general pattern of how Hindutva terror in the country is going unchecked, while anyone dissenting against the current regime is likely to have their houses raided, cases filed against them, and threatened with incarceration. Fourth, the BK16 incarcerations mark the rise of targeted state-driven attempts to silence dissenters, which are backed by the highest levels of government. Again, I don't have time to go into the evidence for it, which is laid out in the book. Fifth, the use of new weapons, cyber warfare, to silence opponents and curb dissenters. Sixth, the BK16 reveals how, the case reveals how Prime Minister Modi and his whole organizations, with their many arms, have captured so many democratic institutions, universities, the judiciary especially. Alongside this is the ability of the regime in power to dominate media narratives. So mainstream television has already been co-opted by the corporate houses who now own all the channels and are in the pocket of the regime in power. And those journalists who are bold enough to challenge the government narrative are silenced, as is evident with the number of raids on independent news outlets, cases filed against media professionals, and their arrests, and how so many of the independent journalists have now had to set up YouTube channels. And just in the last couple of weeks now, even those YouTube channels are being targeted. This brings me to an eighth point, the very close pact with and reciprocity between the regime in power and the growth of multinational corporate capitalists. Modi has created homegrown oligarchs, which include some of the richest men, not only in India, but in the world, right? Gautam Adani, complete homegrown oligarch, was a small-time diamond merchant, was at one point the second richest man in the world. Slight dent because of this Hindenburg research report in the US, but he's still rising. Inequality has risen. The wealthiest 1% now own more than 40% of the total wealth of the country. According to Thomas Piketty, India is now one of the most unequal countries in the world. And finally, what is revealed through the BK case is how we in the West and our economic and financial institutions can be complicit in not only propping up but also weaponizing a regime that wants to target democratic rights activists. Again, I don't have time to go into detail on all of this, but it's shown in the way in which the Unlawful Activities Prevention Acts have been strengthened through Paris-based organizations, which many countries like India want to join, but have to comply with their regimes, which actually lead to them weaponizing their own anti-terror laws against human rights defenders, apart from the obvious kind of embrace that, Trump gave to Modi, or that Cameron gave to Modi when he arrived in the UK or in the US, and the continuing negotiations. India is not China. That's what everyone wants to believe, and that's why we need India. Desperately need India. Okay. So alongside unveiling this extraordinary case and using it to chart the repression of freedom and the collapse of the world's largest democracy, one of the main questions I ask in the Incarcerations is, why target the BK16? Why were they so dangerous? To answer this question, the incarceration dives deep into the lives and work of the BK16. Studying these incarcerated intellectual activists, I learned a number of things about the fight for democracy, economic and social justice that I'd like to share with you today. To do that, let me give you a very brief introduction to those incarcerated. And I'll begin with this person here, Sudha Bharadwaj, who at the time of her arrest was teaching law, a professor at the National Law University in Delhi. But she was a trained human rights lawyer. For many years had worked in the central Indian state of Chhattisgarh as a human rights lawyer. She began her life as a trade union activist. Began her life as in began her working life. She was actually she came from a very privileged upper caste family background. Her parents, she was born here in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, and she was raised in Cambridge, UK. Her mother was a very famous economist, Krishna Bharadwaj, who set up the economics faculty at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Sudha, having grown up in Cambridge, UK, and Cambridge, went and on the JNU campus on this very privileged background, she actually moved to the central Indian state of Chhattisgarh, a very, very poor state, to fight for labor rights. And she became a devoted kind of trade unionist. But at the age of 40, she retrained herself as a lawyer to expand her work from labor rights to fighting for the justice of indigenous people whose land was being stolen for mining operations and who faced the brutality of the Indian security forces who were violently dispossessing them, incarcerating and killing them. She said about this expansion, I'm going to read a little section again, so you get a flavor of Sudha Bharadwaj from the book itself. So this is about her expansion from trade unionism to labor rights. She said to me, if there's a fire in one room of your house, can you pray in another room? If there is a corpse in one room of your house, can you sing songs in another room? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, Sudha said. PUCL, which is a People's Union for Civil Liberties, a democratic rights organization. India has many, many democratic rights organizations across the country who have been fighting to preserve democracy on the ground through social movements. So India had this terrible period called the Indian Emergency in 1975 to 77, when Indira Gandhi suspended all democratic powers and had a kind of declared emergency. And so these organizations grew in their aftermath, saying that, we will never let this country see that kind of repression of freedom again. So PUCL, this is one of these organizations. Chhattisgarh was crumbling as Sudha took charge of it. Sudha revived monthly PUCL meetings, ensured members kept in regular touch, shared information and concerns for civil liberties issues. Sudha encouraged local chapters of the PUCL to develop across the state, brought together activists to investigate abuses of human rights through fact-finding missions, and traveled to far corners of the country she had never visited before. What Sudha saw deeply moved her. She explained, increasingly it became more clear to us that the factories are not the only battleground against imperialist and monopoly capital. The hardest struggles are in the countryside, where these companies are zeroing in on mineral resources and are engaged in a land grab on an unbelievable scale. The problem was that apart from those who were living it, almost no one, not even Indians living in Calcutta, Mumbai or Delhi, knew that in the forests of central India, a bloody war was being declared on its own citizens to forcibly displace them. Sudha said, I could only grasp the enormity of the information blackout, the silence, half-truths and sheer lies, call it the wall of silence, that existed between Basta, the part of Chhattisgarh, and the rest of Chhattisgarh, when as an active member of the Chhattisgarh PUCL, I joined several fact-finding teams to investigate fake encounters. Sudha said that in the forest reserve of Golapalli in the south of the state, they had found that the teaching assistants and a student allegedly killed in Maoist crossfire had actually been murdered by the security forces. A few hours away in a district called Narayanpur, Adivasis who had returned to their ancestral village in search of work had been killed and presented as dreaded Naxalites encountered. In the neighboring district, in a Salva Judum displacement camp in Charpal, villagers were boldly refuting the police presentation of an accidental killing and said that it was a trigger-happy soldier who had killed the woman and a baby. Sudha wrote, "In the media we repeatedly saw a total silence about ordinary people on the one hand and symbol-clashing war cries against Maoists, always pictured as AK-47 toting with sinisterly covered faces on the other. Each time we uncovered the truth, which mind you was absolutely self-evident to the local people, and tried to cross the wall, it was buried again under a heap of papers, false statements, inquiries, and the inevitable conclusions justifying the atrocities." Under Sudha's care, the PUCL membership in Chhattisgarh grew from a small handful in 2007 to 300 in 2017. For an organization in which members had to pay expenses from their pockets for any activity, whether it was taking a bus, hiring a car, or daily subsistence, it was impressive. People were drawn to her, said Ajay TG, a local filmmaker who worked closely with Sudha as a PUCL member. She was always so polite and respectful, lived so simply among the workers, and worked so hard. Despite being such an intellectual, she had no intellectual arrogance, not even 1%. She never forced her views on others, did not sit on a platform, but with workers. Sudha's civil liberties work led her to encourage and help local activists to establish the Chhattisgarh Bachao Andolan, Save the Chhattisgarh movement in 2010, with the aim of trying to unite all the various people's resistance against displacement from across the countryside. Sudha found that many people were resisting dispossession from their homes, but their fight was easily snuffed out as their numbers were so small and their resistance fragmented. The Chhattisgarh Bachao Andolan allowed these different resistance movements to unite, to learn from each other, and to support each other. Sudha also formed a lawyers' collective, which she called Janhit, a kind of legal aid wing of the Chhattisgarh Bachao Andolan, she explained. It was Sudha's solution to what she called one of the biggest enigmas of a human rights lawyer, the fact that the people who need you the most are able to pay you the least, in fact, can't afford to pay you at all. These were no ordinary lawyers. Sudha and those she attracted to Janhit saw themselves as people's lawyers, fighting for the expansion of poor people's democratic rights on the ground. Sudha aptly summarized their approach. "One thing which has always been a part of my thinking is kagaj ki ladai and sarak ki ladai. The paper fight and the street fight are like two legs. You have to have both." Within 6 years, Sudha and her team had a profile of 250 cases: environmental litigation, forest rights, land acquisitions, habeas corpus cases, mass rapes, and counter killings. From being just a thorn in the flesh of Lafarge-Holcim, which is a Swiss multinational who she had been fighting against for labor rights, she had become a thorn in the flesh of many more multinational corporations, including Essar, Tata, Jindal, Balco, Vedanta, DV Power, and the Adani Group, who I mentioned earlier. So, if Sudha Bhardwaj had become a thorn in the side of a state corporate nexus in Chhattisgarh state, Stan Swamy, who I spoke about earlier, had done the same in the neighboring Jharkhand state. Like Sudha, Stan Swamy had stood against the attempts to grab the land of Adivasis and turn their forests into open-cast mines. Indeed, India's richest mineral reserves of iron ore, bauxite, coal lie under Adivasi territories. In the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Orissa, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, Telangana, and northern Andhra. So it's this kind of central and eastern, like this belt in the middle of India. Like Sudha, Stan had nurtured many indigenous rights activists to use the constitutional provisions to fight for their rights, supporting and developing their social movements in far corners of the state. Among the corporations who found it hard to open power plants and mines in Jharkhand as a result was the Adani Group, Gautam Adani, Modi's homegrown oligarch, who I mentioned earlier. Just to note that this is the same Adani who has now funded the Green Energy Gallery at London Science Museum, which opened about 3 weeks ago, I think, or last month, or maybe early this month, to huge environmental and climate justice protests. Although Stan was not a lawyer, like some of the BK16, just before his arrest, he had also filed a petition, a public interest litigation, against the Jharkhand state for holding thousands of poor Adivasis, Dalits, and other minorities in prison for years without trial as alleged terrorists. Stan had documented these unjust incarcerations and was trying to get them out of jail, all these people who would never have had any kind of legal representation and would simply rot there for years on end. He was fighting against the misuse of the same anti-terror laws under which he himself was imprisoned. Like Stan and Sudha, several of the others were also fighting for indigenous rights against the land grabs by multinational corporations for mining operations and against counterinsurgency operations, which, in the name of erasing Naxalite guerrillas, had killed thousands of Adivasis, imprisoned many more, and dispossessed tens of thousands. For instance, there was Mahesh Raut, here on this side, a grassroots forest rights democracy activist, just 31 years old, who was mobilizing Adivasis in Maharashtra against the government giving over a large section of their forests to an iron ore mining company, or Surendra Gadling, also based in Maharashtra, a 47-year-old human rights lawyer who was also a Dalit and had inspired and nurtured many Dalit human rights lawyers. Over the decades, he had successfully fought the cases of many Adivasis, Dalits, and other minorities imprisoned in Maharashtra without trial under anti-terror laws. There was also a Delhi-based 46-year-old researcher, Rona Wilson, a prisoners' rights activist. 44-year-old Arun Ferreira in the front was, like Sudha Bhardwaj and Surendra Gadling, a human rights lawyer, author of a book, and wrote and illustrated a politics column in an online magazine with his friend, the 60-year-old Vernon Gonzalez, behind him, also incarcerated. Among the professors who were incarcerated, aside from Sudha Bhardwaj, there was the 59-year-old Shoma Sen, head of Department of English Literature, Nagpur University, a women's rights activist also advocating for Dalits and Adivasis. Hani Babu, a 54-year-old associate professor, Department of English, Delhi University, who had fought to make the university campus more democratic for Adivasis, Dalits, and Muslims. Babu wrote quite erudite papers on syntax in English literature, which I couldn't quite get my head around, but also the occasional brilliant article, including one which argued that Hindi was the language of decolonization because in India, Hindi was the language of colonialism of upper castes, and that the decolonial language which united all subaltern groups like Dalits was in fact English. And then there was also India's foremost anthropologist of caste, 69-year-old Professor Anand Teltumde, a professor of data management at Goa Institute of Management, but Teltumde wrote anthropology books by night. He wrote about the fight against caste discrimination and its relationship to capitalism. He wrote against an identitarian politics targeting Dalits in particular. He also wrote about the significance of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who drafted the Indian Constitution, who happened to be his grandfather-in-law, who was a Dalit. And he wrote how Baba Saheb Ambedkar was being captured by Hindutva forces, and Dalits were too easily being seduced into the Hindutva project, giving them the Dalit voice. For all of these thoughts and more, Anand Teltumde had a regular column called Margin Speaks in India's most well-regarded journal, Economic and Political Weekly. This photo, incidentally, is taken at the London School of Economics, where we have a bust of Ambedkar, because Ambedkar was an alumni of the LSE, and this was on one of his visits on one of our project meetings as an advisor. That's his wife Rama Teltumde, who happens to be the granddaughter of Ambedkar. Several others also worked on Dalit issues in a similar theoretical vein, but in different ways. As poets, artists, and publishers, they included Jyoti Jagtap, Sagar Gorkhe, and Ramesh Gaichor of the Kabir Kala Manch. This was a troupe of bards, people's poets, all in their 30s, who sang powerful songs against caste oppression, capitalism, and inequality, and attracted like thousands of people to their performances. And they included Sudhir Dhawale, there he is, a Dalit poet, writer, and publisher. Other poets included the 78-year-old Varvara Rao from Hyderabad, a translator, a revolutionary writer, author of several books, literary critic, and activist. And then there was my friend Gautam Navlakha, a journalist of the Economic and Political Weekly for 3 decades, author of 2 books on insurgency and counterinsurgency. Since the late 80s, Navlakha has drawn attention to the human rights abuses by state counterinsurgency forces on Muslims in Kashmir, later in the northeast of India, and then in the Adivasi forests of the center. The BK16 I devote kind of entire chapters to their lives and works. The BK16 were, in short, custodians of democracy and crusaders of justice. They had tried to uncover the hidden truths behind the atrocities in the far corners of the country where most people would not dare to go. They had stood by, supported, and grown grassroots people's movements against injustice and inequality as they emerged on the ground in different parts of the country. They were all working for the democratic rights and terms of social and economic justice for India's three main minorities, its most marginalized and oppressed communities: 200 million Muslims, 200 million Dalits, and 100 million Adivasis. Now, I should note that the BK16 are not the only ones doing this kind of work in this way and on these issues. Indeed, in unveiling the histories of grassroots activism against inequality and injustice, the Incarcerations shows that the BK16, that India actually has this very long and robust tradition of democratic rights activists, intellectual activists, who like the BK16 have been work in these ways. They are actually very difficult to silence. Many of them live very simply with few possessions or assets. Their main wealth is their courage, their determination, and willingness to relentlessly work for justice. They can't really be attacked in the way that NGOs or media organizations have been in India through tax authorities raiding their offices or foreign regulations acts which have been weaponized against them in the last few years. 16,000 NGOs have had the tax authorities raid them in the last few years. Most have had to close. They can't be bulldozed outright or quietly terminated or incarcerated by the state security forces, as has happened to so many powerless Adivasis in central and eastern India, Muslims in Kashmir, and because they are kind of very wide, they're well known, they're connected, they live in the cities. Extraordinary measures are needed to clip their wings, and the BK16 Incarcerations sought to send a strong message to anyone daring to do similar kinds of work that one day there could also be a knock at your door. Comply with the regime, hide inside your shell, or else you too may find yourself in jail. Okay, so I'm going to conclude, I'm going to draw out some of the distinct threads as to why the BK16 and others like them are so dangerous that they have to be snuffed out by this authoritarian regime. I do so because I believe that the wider theoretical implications of their work and how they went about it is important for any of us anywhere in the world interested in questions of deepening democracy and fighting for economic and social justice. Okay, so let me go through a few my kind of analysis of this. So the first is that they were all fighting against soaring inequalities and injustices generated by corporate capitalism and its pact with the state. Second is most of the BK16 were working not only for labor rights, which is the classic struggle of the left, but also against the violence of the accumulation by dispossession of land and forests for extraction, enabled by the state and multinational corporation nexus. This included a fight for environmental justice, for indigenous land and forest rights, and the fight for the basic human rights of those who were dispossessed, incarcerated, or killed at the hands of the state. This is particularly why they were such a nuisance, both for the Indian state and its crony capitalists, the oligarchs, who had been promised access to the coal and other mineral resources under those lands. The third is that alongside their fight against the capital state nexus, they all took casteism, racism seriously. They all centered an analysis of racial capitalism. At the same time, and fourth, they sought to create a non-identitarian, inclusive, cross-class alliances. So they argued against a politics which says that only Dalits can represent Dalits, or you have to be black to represent black people. You see this very explicitly being argued by Dalit intellectuals like Anand Teltumde or the people's poets of the Kabir Kala Manch. Anand Teltumde, for instance, was only all too aware about the divisions between and within Dalits and how many Dalits were turning to Hindutva forces and getting co-opted by them. Indeed, his writings were addressed as much to Dalits as they were to others. Similarly, those who worked deeply with indigenous people, like Stan Swamy, recognized some of the unique values of indigenous ways of life, but at the same time did not romanticize indigenous people or their ontologies. They were extremely astute to internal differences within indigenous communities, that many were being co-opted by the state and capital against their own brothers and sisters, for instance, and hence also the need to create alliances against these dividing forces. Fifth, they worked against the explicit ostracization, stripping of citizenship, and creation of internal enemies of some groups, namely Muslims. India under Prime Minister Modi has systematically disenfranchised Muslims, and there is no attempt by the regime to even hide it. In fact, today, the Financial Times has a column on how Modi has, in his election campaign, been using a huge anti-Muslim rhetoric. I read earlier today. On the contrary, the denigration of Muslims is something that is now publicly celebrated, encouraged to be celebrated. Sixth, they were seeking to unite and create alliances between different kinds of grassroots movements for justice. So they were both seeking specificities of particular struggles, but also bringing them together. And many worked on several different movements at the same time. So Gautam Navlakha, for example, worked on Muslims in Kashmir, but also on Adivasis in the center and east of the country, arguing for different kinds of things for these different groups based on the specificity of their needs. Seventh, all of them saw the legal struggle and the social movement struggle to go hand in hand. As Sudha Bhardwaj put it, I said earlier, the paper fight and the street fight were both necessary. Several even became lawyers to fight against the injustices faced by marginalized citizens using the protective measures of India's constitution, but they also saw the extreme deficiencies of the implementation of the law in delivering justice, how protective laws were constantly being undermined, and worked closely with social movements on the ground to raise awareness of people's constitutional rights, call the state to account. Eighth, they were all intellectuals and activists at the same time. They wrote articles, books, poetry, plays, all of them, right? They had different forms of intellectual production, but they also played a central role in protests, demonstrations, rallies, social movements on the ground. Ninth, one of the most remarkable attributes of most of these intellectual activists is how versatile they were. They were working in different spheres of all at the same time, whether it was as a trade unionist and as a lawyer, whether it was as a professor in a university and fighting for prisoners' rights. 10th, although they all came from different class backgrounds, some were born in the slums of Pune, like the Kabir Kalamanch, and others in elite university environments of Harvard, Massachusetts, like Sudha Bhardwaj. They could reach deep into some of the most marginalized communities and their social movements, but also had national and sometimes international reach. Sudha Bhardwaj, she was actually, I think the Harvard Law School had a celebration of her when she was imprisoned and put her had a picture of her in a major photo exhibition of women around the world, inspirational women around the world, next to New Zealand Prime Minister. Okay. So it's no surprise then that the BK16 inspired and gave support to many others to work alongside them under an authoritarian regime promoting a global order based on gross injustice and extreme inequalities. No wonder they had to be silenced. But the incarceration of the BK16, I think, has also allowed me to dwell deep into their lives and work to distill today for you these 10 most important ingredients for deepening democracy and fighting for social and economic justice, which I believe have global resonance. In doing so, we keep alive and spread the spirit of the BK16's ideas and praxis of democracy and justice. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. Thanks.
It's 5 o'clock now, so we can have time for Q&A. Maybe we'll shorten it a bit because we're a bit over time, so perhaps just 10 minutes or so. And I'll be moderating this, and I would just ask that you please keep your questions to the format of a question and not a comment, a longer comment. So thanks so much. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an informative and thoroughly researched work. My question is really, I feel like all the other 10 points feels straightforward, but centered in analysis of racial and caste capitalism. Can you say a bit more on that? How race and caste are linked together with capitalism?
Sure, maybe we can collect a few questions. So any other questions anyone would like to ask? Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a quick question about the implication of this issue on the ongoing election. So has the coalition opposing the BJP campaigned on this issue at all and signaled they'd free the incarcerated if they get elected, or has this been swept under the rug?
Yes, yes, I have a question. I would love if you could say more about the Hima Koregang event itself and the role of Dalits in this story, and also if you can speak. I know you've been writing a bit about decolonization as well. There's a new piece coming out that isn't out yet, but if you can talk about how that intersects with this case and what we might learn, how it complicates maybe how we're talking about that in the U.S. right now.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'll just answer your question very quickly, and then I'm going to talk to both of your questions together. But yeah, it's not been a major campaign issue of the opposition at all. I can't say it's being swept on the carpet anymore because this book is everywhere. It's in all the airports and it's in all the bookshops and it's being spread and read. It was published on March the 14th in India. And there are individuals who have spoken in favor of individual politicians, since you're asking about the opposition party, who have spoken in favor of the BK16, but it hasn't become a kind of big election issue. It's a really interesting question. So I think best explained by the work of Anand Teltunde, who basically argues that what we are seeing with the spread of capitalism in India is how it has entrenched caste differences. So, against the kind of narratives of modernization, which said that caste is going to go away with the spread of capitalism and with the arrival of modernity, what he is arguing is that capitalism is racialized, that capitalism has been entrenching caste, and we need to fight casteism. We have to pay attention to not just untouchability and the reproduction of the caste system, but we have to crucially pay attention to the ways in which capitalism is now one of the main generators of caste differences. So that's the way. I mean, they don't go into these intricate debates about whether caste existed before capitalism or not. At least I haven't come across that. The big debates in the racial capitalism debates that we had in scholarly world, did it exist before, or did it, was it a product of its own? They're not so much, as far as I know, going into that, but they're just looking at the ways in which, contrary to what has been said, we are getting a reproduction of casteism, and that we have to have a critique of capitalism alongside a critique of casteism. Yeah. And the decolonization is so interesting, and the reason why I wanted to take these two questions together is that in India, decolonization has been completely appropriated by the Hindutva regime, right? So what Modi is saying and what his organizations are saying and what his student wings are saying is that this is the first decolonial prime minister. This is the first decolonial regime. India has been colonized for 1,000 years, first by the British, then before that the Mughal empires, and now finally we are going to have this is real decolonization taking place. And what I argue is that actually how we have to be so astute to when this language of decolonization is hijacked for authoritarian forces, and how, in fact, in my opinion, the BK16 intellectuals are par excellence the most significant anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-caste or anti-race intellectuals. They would never use the language of decolonization to explain what they do because that has been hijacked within India. So we've got to look at the content of what people are arguing and fighting. And similarly, I think the Bhima Koregaon event is so interesting because that obelisk that I showed you a picture of, the obelisk which is at the center of the celebrations, was actually built by the British to celebrate a battle in 1818 which was the Battle of Koregaon, in which they had fought off an upper caste Peshawar empire, which enabled them to consolidate their rule over the whole of India. So this obelisk, which the Dalits now celebrate, was actually built by the British as a British War Memorial. If you look on the War Memorial, you will see that there's a plaque, and on the plaque there are the names of many Dalits. Dalits were a regiment in the British Army. It's well known that Dalits joined the British Army as a way to escape casteism of their villages, as a way to escape caste. And what was happening at Bhima Koregaon is the Dalits started celebrating this war memorial to say that it was they who had fought against the upper caste Peshawar Empire, which was a very, very casteist empire, very brutal caste oppression under it, and they had victoriously won. Okay, they were soldiers in the British Army, that's by the by, but this was their memorial. So they had appropriated a British war memorial as their own fight over upper caste in India. The reason why they were attacked by the Hindutva mobs was that you can't celebrate this, this is a British battle you're celebrating. You guys were, part of the British Army. This, so the same arguments, that this is a colonial, they're celebrating colonialism, and they're celebrating, and this is what is dividing Indians. We have to all unite. So that's why there was this campaign to stop these celebrations at Bhima Koregaon, run by the Hindutva regime, which basically there is no such thing as caste in India. There isn't such a thing. We are all one, right? And so they attacked the Dalits. So I guess what I'm highlighting, especially in the paper, which is about to be published in American Anthropologist, is how we have to look at this internal colonization, which is ongoing, which is a part of how decolonization is actually operationalized, and how it is the language now of the Hindutva. And this is not something that is far away in India, but we have it appearing on the campuses in Oxford and LSE, where there have been these big issues in the university when students attached to Hindutva forces have basically argued, against other students, claiming Hinduphobia, and so, and I think we in the university have, because there's been this moral kind of movement around decolonization, which has almost blinded us to analyzing what is actually happening in the name of decolonization. We have to be extremely astute to how it's being used and weaponized, and that's happening all around us, so, yeah.
So I think, unless there's any other, would you?
Can I ask a quick question? Because you very briefly mentioned China and said, India is not China, and that's why we need to support India. If activists like this in China, for decades now, they've been associated with the label of dissident, and that's become their identity, both in China as well as amongst international organizations and groups that support them, etc. Is something like that happening in India? Is there a group of being identified as dissidents to the regime in the same way?
Yeah, it's not quite there yet in the same way, but we are now seeing it. There are so many academics who are now exiled, journalists who have been kicked out, who can't operate in India anymore, who've left the country. We have many stories that are emerging, some which are told and many which are not told, of people who have been basically kicked out, taken out of universities. Pratap Parumedda, one of India's most eminent, political scientists, who is at Princeton. There are, I can't say that there is this label that is being used in the same way as in China, but yeah, I think Modi is definitely, is going to win the next election, so we will see what happens under that regime, and whether, I think India is a very, very diverse country, and books like this are still being published, and there are still journalists working on the ground, so there is the hope for, keeping the seeds of democracy alive, so that we don't have to, I guess, there isn't this, it doesn't get the way China is, but let's see. Yeah, that's a hopeful answer.
Maybe one final question, yeah.
If India does move in the direction of China, so as it becomes more powerful, it becomes more authoritarian, how wise is it to seek deeper economic relations with India, or are we sort of making the same mistakes we made with China?
Sorry, what was the question?
So if India is more like China and it becomes more authoritarian as it becomes more powerful,
Yeah.
is it smart to want closer economic relations with India?
No, I think all of those who have been calling to account what is happening in India, which includes, very well-known journalists in the Financial Times and New York Times, apart from many scholars, academics, are all saying that we have to, stop the trade deals, call to account what is happening, the atrocities happening under the Modi regime right now. That are being, just kept out of the public eye and ignored by our leaders, who actually are, on the contrary, inviting Modi at the, he came to the Summit for Democracy that Joe Biden organized here last year, and it's at that place where he was allowed to say that India is now not only the oldest democracy, but the mother of democracy. That's where he made that speech. So it's. Yeah, I think obviously Canada's had a different policy, and I think we should be looking towards those models. Yeah.
Well, I think we should wrap up now and move into the next room where we have a poster session as well from projects connected to the Justice in Asia program. So I'd like to thank you all so much, and thank you, Professor Shah, for this amazing talk.